From Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio, it's The Big Take. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, India aims to become the next economic powerhouse. As many of the world's biggest economies have slowed recently, India is spending billions of dollars to attract global investors and boost manufacturing. Prime Minister Narendra Modi aims to propel India to the top ranks of world economic powers, alongside the U.S. and China. And with a population of 1.4 billion, it's edging past China as the country with the most people on Earth. But to meet his goals, Modi will have to tangle with the remnants of India's bureaucracy and a legacy of corruption that has held the country back, and also deal with the stark gap between rich and poor. We dig into all of that today. My colleagues Kai Schultz and Vrishti Beniwal have written a deeply reported story about India's growth.
Banks have predicted that India will drive a fifth of world expansion this decade, making it only one of three in the world that can generate more than $400 or so billion in annual output growth.
Apple has been boosting its manufacturing in India. It has been exporting phones which are made in India. So there is some promise, it seems now.
We'll hear from them in just a bit. First, Milan Vaishnav joins me. He's director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And he joins me now to talk about Prime Minister Modi, the man who is pushing for India to reach these ambitious goals. Milan, today we're talking all about India's ambitions. How much can we attribute India's recent economic growth to Modi himself?
Well, I think that's a very complicated question. I mean, undoubtedly, as the prime minister, he gets the blame or credit for India's trajectory. But, India has seen a revolution in its economic performance since the early 1990s, when it underwent pretty sweeping, market-friendly, liberal economic reforms, right? And so in some sense, much of the dynamism we see in India over the past more than quarter century is a result of those reforms. In fact, Prime Minister Modi's economic performance since coming to power in 2014 has been rather patchy. Now, of course, he's had some external shocks like COVID, but he's also had some self-inflicted wounds like demonetization, this wild idea that you can invalidate almost all Indian currency overnight in a failed attempt to curb corruption. I think what we are seeing right now is really the product of larger international factors. And the fact that at a time that China is slowing, there are a lot of headwinds in the Western economies, India, in relative comparison, looks like the healthy performer.
One of the things that has driven the growth, I imagine, is India's population growth. How much is just this enormous population itself a driver of economic growth that may have happened no matter who was in charge?
Well, I think it's definitely an important factor. I mean, economists have this term called the demographic dividend, which is some countries have this youth bulge of people who start from their early 20s and go on to their early 60s when they are in the prime working condition of their lives. And India has just a massively large number of people who are in that category. I mean, it sort of boggles the mind, but, more than 1 million Indians are joining the labor force every month. And that process is going to continue for the next couple of decades. And so it is definitely seen as a plus, but I should, just issue a caveat here, which is this is premised on people finding gainful employment that is going to sustain them, sustain their families, sustain their homes. And we are seeing right now a reasonable level of economic growth, but we are not seeing commensurate growth in job creation, right? So I do think that is a warning sign for people who are looking out and trying to figure out, where is the Indian economy going to be, say, 5 or 10 years from now? The unemployment rate in India is very low because as a poor country, you have to work. You don't have the option of not working. The problem is people are working in ways that are not up to their potential. They are working part-time. They are working in informal parts of the economy.
I'd like to talk for a moment about some of the challenges that Modi has faced at home. You mentioned one of them, demonetization, which caused a lot of unrest. Can you talk just a bit about what that was and what happened?
Yeah, so two pretty large world-changing events happened in November 2016. One of them was the election of Donald Trump in the United States, and the other was this thing we call demonetization, where Modi came on television that evening and basically said that by the stroke of midnight, 86% of Indian currency will be invalidated. And these are higher denomination notes. And that doesn't mean your money's worthless. You can come in to deposit those bills into the bank or trade them in for new bills. The idea being that if you are corrupt and if you are hoarding quote unquote black money or unaccounted for money, you're not going to want to come up to the bank and say, here's suitcases full of cash, right? So you will just basically forfeit a lot of money. This created, as you might imagine, a massive panic, right? Everyone running to the banks, everyone figuring out how to pay their suppliers. The entire economy sort of, hit a giant pause button. And so they went through this rather bizarre, draconian exercise that essentially was a wash in terms of cleansing the economy of this so-called black money. Now, one positive is that it did push people into digital forms of payment. So we have seen a digital payments revolution in India play out over the last 5 or 6 years. But the question is, might there have been more humane, more gentle ways of doing that rather than putting the entire economy on pause?
And yet Modi recovered from that. How did he wind up, sort of calming all of this discontent?
It was very unpopular amongst economists who didn't think of it as a very sound policy, but it actually was very popular among some Indians because despite the fact that they had to go through hardship and wait in interminably long bank queues and so on and so forth, they thought for the first time, somebody is trying to stick it to the fat cats who have fleeced this country, right? So I may be suffering as an ordinary Indian waiting in line, but think about the really rich, corrupt person. That person is really going to suffer. Now, in the end, that person didn't suffer, but people thought at least he's doing something. What is the opposition doing, right? Modi has taken the biggest action against black money in 75 years of this country, and we support him. So not only did it not hurt him, it helped him win elections.
And another big challenge he faced more recently was when he angered a lot of farmers. Can you talk about what happened there?
Yeah, so, agriculture has been in a pretty woeful state in India for many years. A large section of the population is employed in the agricultural workforce, but agriculture does not contribute a commensurate amount to the country's GDP. Agriculture tends to be a very low productivity activity in India. And economists have long called for a liberalization of that sector to allow for more freedom of internal trade in India, a greater participation of the private sector, to try and eliminate the role of middlemen in markets so that farmers and buyers or farmers and consumers can be more directly linked. So what Modi did was to pass a series of bills in Parliament without any consultation, either with, frankly, other political parties or any of the state governments. And agriculture is a state subject under the Indian Constitution. And so this is an area that states have jealously guarded. The central government acted by saying, well, this is in the national interest, and actually it has interstate commerce implications, so therefore we can act. This created such an uproar amongst farmers, particularly farmers in the northern stretches of India in states like Punjab and Haryana, who have been in some regards the biggest beneficiaries of the existing scheme, the existing subsidy scheme, the existing kind of state-managed scheme.
We begin in India, where tens of thousands of angry farmers have been camping outside the capital of New Delhi. They're protesting against the government's new agricultural laws, which they say could devastate crop prices and reduce their earnings. Some say they're, quote, ready to die in a showdown with Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
And it was one of those rare times where the political and popular blowback, again, maybe just limited to this section of the country, was so large. And farmers are seen as such a critical vote bank that the government had to withdraw those bills and withdraw those reforms. So we're basically back to square one today in India.
One thing that Modi has done, which has drawn a lot of scrutiny from the rest of the world, has been to take a pretty hard line on religious freedom. And I wonder how that's playing out in India itself among different portions of population. Can you explain a bit about how that's happened?
Well, I think you have to start by looking at Mr. Modi's party, the BJP. The BJP, in shorthand, is often referred to as India's Hindu nationalist party. What does that mean? In a nutshell, it means that these are people who believe that Hindu culture and Indian culture are synonymous, that they're one and the same. And because Hindus make up roughly 80% of the population, what they say should go for the entire country. And this is really the movement in which Mr. Modi and his party are steeped, right? So you could call it a pro-Hindu movement, a Hindu majoritarian movement. But India is a country of extreme diversity, right? 14% of the population are Muslim. And you might say, well, 14% is not a huge number, but that means more than 230 or 40 million odd Muslims, plus a range of other religious identities. And so there has been a lot of tension between Hindus and other religious minorities over who belongs, over who truly is an Indian. And this government, particularly in its second term, which began in 2019, has implemented a number of policies and programs which are seen as openly pro-Hindu and in some cases distinctly anti-Muslim.
Has that been popular, just given the large Hindu majority?
By and large, yes. We don't have great public policy polling data in India, but, let elections speak for themselves. And what we have seen is that Narendra Modi and his party have largely been rewarded for many of these policies. Now, there are many people who believe very strongly in India's secular constitution that had specific safeguards for religious minorities, who feel like this is contrary to the spirit in which India was really founded. And so that is at the heart of the political tension.
Our conversation continues after the break. Milan, you've talked a lot about how Modi has skillfully navigated the various cross currents of Indian society and politics and religion. He's also been very careful in his foreign policy and his approach to other nations.
Well, I think it's a function today of the political and geopolitical environment where you no longer necessarily have the sole superpower of the United States. You have something that looks and feels a little bit closer to a kind of Cold War dynamic where you have, yes, a powerful United States, but a very powerful and rising China. And then you have these kind of middleweight powers. Countries like Russia, like the European Union, a collection of countries, or India, which are seeking to flex their muscles. And what India has tried to do under Modi is really work those seams, right? And basically, when it comes to the United States, say, well, look, we are both worried about China. And so therefore, we should work together on defense and strategic and economic priorities. But India can also say to Russia, no one is buying your oil right now, but we're a poor country who needs your oil. And India feels pretty confident that the world is not going to be able to make India change because they need India on other issues, right? So it is what this government has called a policy of multi-alignment, where it's not that we can't have friends and partners and relationships. It's that we can sort of be promiscuous in how we do that. And we don't necessarily see any incompatibility between being friends with Russia today and being friends with the United States at the same time.
Modi has something like, I think it's 70% popularity ratings in the country. So he must be doing these things fairly right, at least as far as his citizens are concerned. He's up for re-election in 2024 again. Do you think that he will easily win again?
Well, he and his party are in the pole position without a doubt. One of the particularities about this Indian political moment is that there is only one pan-Indian political party that has widespread support, and that is the BJP of Mr. Modi. It's largely, frankly, because of his charisma and popularity. The only other national pole of politics, the Indian National Congress, is a shell of its former self. It has badly lost 2 consecutive elections. It is suffering through a leadership challenge, an ideological or vision challenge, an organizational challenge. So in that vacuum, the BJP really is the only sole hegemon. So I think for most political analysts, the question is not really about 2024, where the BJP looks like they will sail through relatively easily, but really what comes after that. Will there be some kind of creative destruction in the opposition space where either the Congress reinvents itself or other claimants to power, other regional claimants, decide to expand, decide to work together, decide to form some kind of, ad hoc coalitions? That remains to be seen, but at the present moment, the BJP is operating with many degrees of freedom and room to maneuver.
Milan Vaishnav, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's bring in my colleagues, Kai Schultz and Vrishti Beniwal, who have dug into the details about how India plans to catapult itself forward. Vrishti, why don't we start with you? What is Modi doing to attract these billions of dollars in global investment to the country?
So Modi has been trying to attract manufacturing in India for a very long time. It's been his dream since 2014 when he was first elected as Prime Minister of the country to make India a factory for the world. And the government has tried different programs since then to make it work. But unfortunately, nothing has worked so far. As a percentage of GDP, India's manufacturing remains around 14-15% and not moving much. Recently, the government has started offering some incentives where companies, when they boost production in India, they get some financial incentives from the government. And that seems to be working now. We see recently Apple has been boosting its manufacturing in India. It has been exporting phones which are made in India. So there is some promise, it seems now.
One thing you write in this story is that a lot of countries of the world are starting to sort of retract in their economies, whereas India's economy is growing pretty rapidly. Is that right, Kai?
That's right. India's economy is growing quickly, and we've seen rapid growth post-1991, which is when India opened up its economy, it liberalized. Post that period, you saw foreign businesses start to open factories on home soil. You saw the devaluation of the rupee. You saw many efforts to lower tariffs. And so that's all created a much stronger market to compete globally. And India has attempted to capture that momentum. Modi's spending a record amount of India's budget this fiscal year in capital investments. So there's a real push to make it much more of a conducive place to do business. And I think that India has demonstrated some success on that front.
Vrishti, you mentioned how Modi's efforts to make India the manufacturer for the world have had mixed results. And yet we're hearing from Kai how quickly the economy is growing, how people have money to spend. What are some of the industries that are really leading this fast growth in India?
Electronics is clearly a winner, it seems, at the moment. They have been doing well. They have been benefiting from these incentives announced by the government in the recent years. Apart from that, the government has been working in pharmaceutical sector. Software has been India's strength for a very long time now.
And what is India doing to attract big companies like Apple away from China, away from other countries? Because obviously that would be a very big deal if Apple and other large companies were to move more of their production to India.
One of the things that India is doing is providing financial incentives to companies that expand in India. So this is a pool of roughly $24 billion, and it's rolling out over the next few years in more than a dozen industries. So some of that money will support the production of mobile phones, semiconductors, and solar panels. And the aim is to expand the program to manufacturers of other goods in the coming months.
One thing that really stood out to me in your story is that India is creating more of these so-called unicorn companies. These are companies that are worth $1 billion before they go public. What sort of companies are these, and how is India becoming such an engine of new, high-valued companies?
Most of these companies are startups in technology sector. So we have seen these small companies mushrooming in India. There are players who are coming in education sector, food delivery, different mobile apps that are being used, or ride-hailing apps. So we have seen this sector coming up in a big way, and they are able to attract good valuations from investors, and they have been doing pretty well in the recent past. But now there are also questions about the valuations they are attracting. So it remains to be seen that how far these unicorns can go.
Kai, India's population has grown really quickly, and it's also young. I asked Milan Vaishnav this question earlier, and so I'll ask you too. Is India's young population an advantage?
I do think that India's young population is both an advantage and potentially a disadvantage, depending on how the government is able to harness the skills that those people bring to the economy. One of the points that stood out from our reporting was that increasingly young people are not even looking for jobs for a variety of reasons. But one piece of it is that they feel that quality jobs are simply not being created in the market. So on the one hand, you have a very engaged young workforce that's ready, that's educated, and that could potentially do big things in India. On the other hand, you have a government that's still trying to figure out how to put them to work, how to incentivize them to work in factories, how to create enough quality jobs in the services sector. And so I think that that's really going to be one of the key challenges for India moving forward, is how to capitalize on the demographic dividend that they have.
Vrishti, you write that this is especially true of women who have a more difficult time finding quality jobs. Is the government doing anything to encourage more participation, especially of young women in the workforce?
That's true. The participation of women in India's workforce has been falling, and there are estimates ranging from 9% to, say, 19%, which is one of the lowest in the world. Women need to be part of the workforce if the economy has to grow at a fast pace. We are projecting a potential growth rate of 7 to 8% for India. And if women are not part of the workforce, then it will be difficult to achieve that. The government is not doing specifically anything for the women as of now. But yes, there are demands from various quarters that how government can make it easier for women to be part of the workforce, where they participate in big numbers, and it is easier for them to work and grow their career. Right now in India, most of the family burden is on women.
Kai, you talked about how India needs to grow its middle class. That's often the engine of an economy. Certainly that was true in the U.S. and in Europe and even in China. And also how younger people are feeling like there aren't a lot of good quality jobs. Is the divide between people at the top who are building these big companies, getting rich, working for these big companies, and the rest of the country growing?
Inequality is certainly growing in India. Post-liberalization, you see two things happening. Number one, absolute poverty has decreased quite dramatically, which is a great thing for India. And number two, the gap between the rich and the poor has grown. From the government's perspective, not shackling business is a priority. So if that means that these inequalities grow in the short term, that's something they're willing to live with. But it certainly poses the risk of social unrest if India is not able to put more people to work, particularly in jobs that they want to do.
My conversation with Vrishti and Kai continues after the break. Vrishti, can we talk for a minute about India's relationship with China? It's an important relationship. They compete, and there have been some tensions. How do the two nations regard each other?
India and China haven't shared a great relationship, and we have seen tensions on border off and on in recent years. Sometimes the tensions blow up a little bit, but things remain under control. I think both the leaders, India and China, they understand this is not the time. These are two superpowers in Asia and they have to think about their economy. So that is the reason we think that, we have seen some tensions on border, but things are under control and both the leaders are conscious of the fact that they have to take care of their economy. India has to take care of the needs of its 1.4 billion people. It is investment it needs right now. China also has bigger issues to take care of right now. So we believe that they will continue to focus on their economies while protecting their border at the same time.
Vrishti, India will host the G20 summit this year. It's a big platform for Modi to showcase India and make his case to other world leaders. How does Modi intend to take advantage of this opportunity?
Prime Minister Narendra Modi would like to send a strong signal to global leaders as well as investors that India is the place to do business right now. But there is also pressure on him to shift focus from businesses to the poor people ahead of next year's general elections. In 2024, India is going for elections and PM Modi is going to seek a re-election. Again, he has been a prime minister for 2 times now, and for a 3rd time, he will be seeking votes. And there is a lot of pressure on his government to do something for the poor, to create jobs, because we know unemployment is a major issue in the country.
Kai, one of Modi's big goals is to make India the world's 3rd largest economy behind the U.S. and China in a relatively short amount of time. Looking down the road, do you think that that's a realistic goal?
I do think it's a realistic goal. Banks have predicted that India will drive a 5th of world expansion this decade, making it only one of 3 in the world that can generate more than $400 or so billion in annual output growth. And so I think that it's something that's within reach. As we've discussed, growing inequality, problems with employment, and this bigger question of whether India can beef up its manufacturing sector are 3 sticking points. If Modi is successful in improving those, then I think that the country has a real shot.
Kai Schultz, Vrishti, Beniwal, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can read more from Vrishti Beniwal and Kai Schultz at Bloomberg.com. Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Our producer is Federica Romagnello, and our associate producer is Zenab Siddiqui. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.